Hey guys, tonight we drift back through the haze of time to a place where war elephants roamed. The Ganges shimmered beneath monsoon skies, and emperors carried more guilt than gold. You find yourself not on a battlefield exactly, but in the uneasy stillness that follows the eerie silence after the screams have stopped. The year is roughly 261 BCE, and you're shuffling your way through the smoldering remains of Kalinga, an ancient kingdom that has just been crushed under the put up a great empire. There's no music here, no dramatic drums, just the slow creak of a cart carrying the wounded, the buzz of flies, and the soft, dreadful hush that always follows mass destruction. Somewhere in this shadowy scene, you spot a tall figure draped in royal robes, standing motionless. That's Emperor Ashoka, supposed monster who ordered this brutal conquest. And yet, there's something off about him. He's not smiling in triumph. He's staring at the horizon, hollow-eyed, like he's seeing ghosts. You, meanwhile, are trying not to step in a puddle of history you didn't ask to be part of. Bound now that Ashoka's stomach churns with something worse than ambition. Regret. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your feet crunch over broken spears and cracked armor. The air smells like iron and wet earth. This is the moment, so the story goes, when Ashoka's inner world does a full pirouette. He's seen what conquest really looks like. And it's not noble, it's just piles of bodies, ruined families, and a giant empire filled with haunted faces. You watch him walk away from the carnage and into the history books, not as a warlord, but as something stranger, a repentant king, a ruler who decides to spread not swords, but dharma, a slippery word that even the experts still can't agree on. Historians still argue whether it means law, morality, or just Ashoka's own brand of imperial good vibes. Whatever it is, it's about to be chiseled into the very bones of the land. Ashoka doesn't grab a scroll or summon a poet. No, he orders giant slabs of stone to be carved with his thoughts, because apparently he believes everyone loves long, moralistic monologues when they're walking to market. You trail behind a team of stonemasons who sigh as they chip away at a boulder the size of a camel. His Majesty commands kindness. It says in ancient Brahmi script, obey your parents, be nice to strangers, and definitely don't murder anyone. Please and thank you. You might wonder who reads this stuff. The average farmer can't decode imperial script, but that's not the point. These are messages for the gods, for the winds, for future historians, who are apparently going to lose sleep over them, Maker You and Ashoka. He doesn't stop at one message. Over 30 of these edicts begin to appear across the subcontinent. From the Himalayan foothills to the beaches of Tamil Nadu, He's like the world's first motivational poster enthusiast, but with a stone budget and no chill. In one city, you stumble upon a pillar so tall you have to squint into the sun just to see the top perched there. 4 lions standing back to back, a pretty bold branding move, even by modern standards. 1 lion for each cardinal direction, 1 empire trying to roar its moral message across the land. It won't be long before this very symbol gets recycled. India adopts it thousands of years later for their national emblem. Like, yeah, we'll take that. Thanks, Ashoka. But here's the twist: Ashoka wasn't always Mr. Enlightenment. Before Kalinga, he was basically the family disappointment. Not the firstborn, not the favorite. In fact, legend has it, he was exiled at one point and left to govern the distant provinces, sort of the ancient version of being sent to the mailroom. But out there in the margins, he got crafty. He learned the ropes. He built a loyal base. And when his father died, Ashoka swooped in like an overdue email response, firm and impossible to ignore. Some sources claim he killed off his own brothers to secure the throne, but historians still debate whether that was fact or juicy palace gossip. Either way, he came to power in a swirl of ambition and blood. Kalinga was just the exclamation mark at the end of that sentence. So imagine the surprise when this same man, this conqueror, starts preaching peace like a cosmic TED talk. You try to keep up as the narrative pivots from bloodshed to benevolence. 1 minute he's raising armies, the next he's planting medicinal herbs along trade routes. And he doesn't just write to his own people. Oh no. He sends letters to neighboring kings, like some 3rd century BCE email spam. Dear friend in Syria, have you considered not killing each other? Warm regards, Emperor Ashoka. There's even a mention of a Greek king, Antiochus, who, maybe, possibly, got one of these Stone Age newsletters. Historians still argue whether any of these rulers actually read them, or just rolled their eyes and went back to playing ancient Risk. You pass a dusty caravan, trudging down a road that brushes past yet another stone edict. A trader pauses, scratches his head, and mutters something about royal graffiti. You can't blame him. Imagine your country's moral guidelines being carved into traffic signs. Yield, stop, love thy neighbor. And somewhere in all this idealism, you catch something. Ashoka never mentions Buddha by name. Not once. He talks about Dharma, about tolerance, about restraint, but no temples, no statues, no for noble truths. It's as if he's packaging Buddhism for mass consumption, like a cereal brand that's inspired by health food, but mostly sugar, as the stars begin to blink into the evening sky. You watch Ashoka scribble ideas in the dirt with a sticksome half-thought about sending missionaries to Sri Lanka, maybe even further. The wind picks up. The pillars cast long shadows across the fields. The war is over, but something else is just beginning. An empire of ideas held together not by spears, but by stone. And you, dear listener, are just getting started. You keep trudging forward, the air now thick with incense and the occasional whiff of cow dung. Because some things about ancient cities never change. Somewhere nearby, temple bells chime faintly as you follow the steady rhythm of sandals against stone. Ashoka has just walked away from the blood-soaked plains of Kalinga, and now he's diving headfirst into something that, by ancient royal standards, is downright radical. Spiritual self-improvement. You, however, are just trying to keep your eyes open as he goes from iron-fisted emperor to part-time philosopher. There's no formal ceremony, no dramatic lightning strike, just a slow, awkward transformation that starts with guilt and spirals into full-blown religious fervor. Ashoka begins spending more time with monks, especially the ones who don't mind sharing their rice and opinions. He listens to their teachings, and before you know it, he's embracing Buddhism, not the lavish, statue-laden version you might recognize, but the bare-bones early stuff, the kind with lots of walking, begging, and not owning more than 3 probes. This is where the story starts getting a bit murky. You'll hear that Ashoka converted overnight. Others will say it took years. Historians still argue whether his adoption of Buddhism was spiritual, political, or just a really long guilt trip. After all, preaching peace is a pretty good look for someone with a body count in the tens of thousands. You walk beside him now through the capital city of Pataliputram. Imagine something like ancient New Delhi, with fewer honking horns and more elephants. Ashoka's palace gleams in the morning sun, its pillars polished like river stones. He enters, and instead of holding court with generals, he now summons scholars and monks. He wants to understand suffering. He wants to understand himself. You just want a nap. But unfortunately, he's got a long list of reforms to try out first. 1. Buy of his first moves. A complete ban on animal sacrifices at court. You peek into what used to be the royal kitchen and see the cooks looking mildly offended, now stuck experimenting with lentils and root vegetables. It's not just symbolic. Starts promoting vegetarianism across the empire, even though most people politely ignore him and go back to their goat kebabs. The message is loud and clear. The emperor is changing, and not just on his plate. Ashoka also starts building things: monasteries, hospitals, rest houses for weary travelers, shady trees along dusty roads. You pause under one of them, grateful for the break. The whole empire, once braced for military drills, now seems to be pivoting toward a kind of wellness retreat with surprisingly aggressive marketing. Here's a fun little tidbit that makes your historian brain twitch. Ashoka allegedly sent Buddhist emissaries abroad to regions as far-flung as modern-day Egypt, Syria, and Greece. That's right. In an era when most rulers were busy fortifying borders, Ashoka was exporting inner peace. Whether these diplomatic feelers actually made an impact is still debated, of course. Some scholars say it's likely exaggerated. Others believe traces of his influence survived in unexpected corners of the ancient world. Back at home, Ashoka begins using the term Dharma as a kind of imperial lifestyle brand. It's not strictly Buddhist nor Hindu, nor gynets, a catch-all for ethical behavior. You imagine Ashoka holding a press conference, introducing the new and improved Dharma, now with more compassion and 50% less conquest. People nod along, confused but mildly impressed. But he doesn't stop at ideas. He turns his moral values into state policy. You stroll through a rural village and spot a man in official Garba Dharma Mahamata, or one of Ashoka's roving moral inspectors. His job, to check that everyone's behaving nicely, that the elders are respected, the neighbors aren't feuding, and that nobody is sacrificing goats behind the shed. It's all very Big Brother meets Buddhist retreat. And while you might expect some resistance, surprisingly, many people seem to roll with it. Perhaps they're too polite. Perhaps they're just tired of bloodshed. Or maybe, deep down, they like the idea of an emperor who worries more about their virtue than their taxes. As you pass another edict inscribed into a rock, you notice how Ashoka frames his ideas. He doesn't command, he persuades. It is good to be kind. It is best not to harm living beings. It's more gentle encouragement than royal decree, like he's talking to children or the world's most distracted podcast audience. But let's not sugarcoat it too much. Ashoka is still a king, still powerful, still very much in charge. While he claims to have renounced violence, he keeps a firm grip on the reins of his empire. You can't help but notice that peace and obedience often appear in the same sentence. Sure, he's mellow now, but he still expects everyone to follow his lead, preferably without questioning the guy who used to have a habit of tossing rebels into pits. And yet, his sincerity feels oddly real when you see him at prayer quiet, focused, head bowed. It's hard not to believe that something deep inside him really did shift. He becomes a different sort of ruler, not less powerful, but somehow less terrifying. Like a lion who's become very enthusiastic about gardening. You settle by a monastery built under Ashoka's orders. The monks chant in the distance, their voices rising and falling like waves on a sleepy shore. You close your eyes and imagine the ripple effects of Ashoka's transformation. For centuries, Buddhism will spread across Asif from the mountains, play of Tibet to the coasts of Japan, and Ashoka's fingerprints will be all over it. Temples, stories, statues, all connected back to this moment of remorse on a blood-stained field. Still, the irony isn't lost on you. A man who carved peace into stone had first carved war into people. His transformation is inspiring, yes, but also a little sad, a little complicated. Like most human stories, it doesn't fit into neat boxes. And maybe that's the point as you drift into this next leg of the journey. The air smells less like blood and more like sandalwood. A full moon hangs overhead, pale and calm. Ashoka is no longer the man he was. But whether his empire will follow, pin down this path of transformation, that's still a question the stones themselves can't answer. You stretch your legs as the path winds along a dusty plain, dotted with boulders, some natural, some not. One of them looms ahead like a tired mammoth. But as you draw near, you notice the grooves, the symbols, the deliberate hand of a craftsman, more accurately. A team of craftsmen, probably underpaid and overworked. You run your fingers across, put surface of the rock, still rough despite the centuries, and find yourself staring at a message from the past carved in Brahmi script. Congratulations. You've just stumbled upon one of Emperor Ashoka's famous Edicts' Stone Age TED Talk on how to be a better human. This is the dawn of the stone as media era. Before scrolls became widespread, before books were bound, before tweets and status updates flooded your feed. Ashoka was broadcasting his thoughts with chisels and hammers. These edicts aren't meant to dazzle, they're instructional, moral, oddly dad-like in tone. You half expect one to say, "And don't forget to write your mother." Instead, it gently reminds passers-by to respect teachers, honor elders, and avoid killing things. Bold stance for an emperor who once ordered mass slaughter. But hay growth is growth. The first of these rock edicts starts showing up in the 260s BCE. Ashoka's team, a dusty entourage of scribes, translators, and masons, fan out across the empire with what can only be described as ancient billboards. Moral wellness for all. The stones practically shout, though in a sleepy ASMR monotone. You imagine the conversations. "So what are we carving today, boss?" The part about not being a jerk to your parents. Oh, and don't forget the footnote about respecting all sects equally. One peculiar thing stands out. Ashoka doesn't just use one language. Depending on where a rock or pillar is planted, he tailors the script and dialect. Prakrit in Brahmi script is the default, but in the northwestern territories, you'll find Kharosthi script, heavily influenced by Aramaic. There's even one edict written in Greek, yes, ancient Greek, because Ashoka knew his audience, and his audience sometimes wore togas. Historians still argue whether this multilingualism was a brilliant move to foster inclusivity, or simply a logistical nightmare. Either way, it makes him feel startlingly modern. Like that app you download because it offers 42 languages and a gentle reminder. Voice option. You sit beneath a slab of rock so large it creates its own shade and read the translated words. Be loud, they're dry, a little repetitive, and yet oddly comforting. Ashoka talks about moderation, about justice, about his love for all living things. He even admits when he messes up. One edict references how he wishes he'd issued some orders earlier than he did. A ruler publicly admitting to a delayed to-do list. Now, that's relatable content. But here's the really curious part. These inscriptions aren't always located in temples or cities. Often, you'll find them halfway up a hillside, near ancient trade routes, or at junctions where travelers are likely to pause. Ashoka wanted his messages to hit when people were alone with their thoughts, maybe a little tired, maybe even, dare we say, it's ready to listen. It's like leaving a motivational quote in a hiking trail bathroom stall. You didn't expect it, but it sticks with you as you follow one of these ancient roads. You come upon a pillar, a tall one, polished, smooth, and glinting like caramel under the sun. This is no random rock, it's an Ashokan pillar, part of his most famous architectural project. Roughly 40 such pillars were erected, though only a few survive intact today. Some stand alone in the wilderness, some near ancient cities, others orphaned in fields where modern farmers have no idea. They're plowing next to a piece of moral history. These pillars aren't just message boards, they're also statements, have power, elegance, and artistic skill. The sandstone, likely quarried in Chunar, was dragged across terrifying distances, shaped by expert masons, and polished until it shone like glass. That's a lot of effort to tell people to be nice. You imagine Ashoka pacing his palace, muttering, "If I just say be kind, they'll forget. But if I carve it into a 40-foot column, boom, eternal wisdom." Atop one of these pillars sits the most famous of them all, the lion capital of Ashoka. 4 lions, facing out in 4 directions, stand on a circular base, adorned with wheels and animals. An elephant, a bull, a horse, and a lion again. The imagery is layered, symbolic, and still open to interpretation. Some say it represents the Buddha's teachings spreading across the world. Others say it's Ashoka flexing his imperial reach look. I rule the whole compass. Historians still argue whether these animals represent specific events or are just early prototypes for political mascots. Today, that very lion capital is the national emblem of India. It's printed on currency, government documents, and even the country's passport. If Ashoka were around now, he'd probably be thrilled or maybe a little embarrassed at how often his sculpture ends up squashed in someone's back pocket. What's most fascinating, though, is how the tone of the inscriptions changes depending on the location. In the core of the empire, the edicts are gentler, more philosophical. On the fringes, they're sterner, more direct. It's the ancient version of tailoring your emails depending on who's reading. Dear frontier tribes, please be civilized. Also, stop stealing each other's goats. Pause at one edict near Kandahar, written in Greek and Aramaic, and realize something else. Ashoka wasn't just speaking to Indians. He was speaking to the world. Not all his efforts landed, of course. Not everyone understood, cared. But that didn't stop him from trying. You can almost hear him saying, "Sure, most people will ignore this, but maybe one kid will read it and choose compassion over cruelty. That's enough." It's a strangely touching legacy. No monuments to victories. No carvings bragging about battles won or riches acquired. Just endless reminders to be better, to be softer, to think. You lean back against the pillar, its surface still faintly warm from the sun, and let your eyes drift close. Around you, birds chirp, wind rustles through dry grasses. The lions above you face 4 directions, roaring silently into time. You, like them, are surrounded by echoes not of conquest, but of quiet change. You continue down the dusty path, sandals crunching softly over pebbles, as another Ashokan edict disappears behind you, half swallowed by time and lichen. You're not quite sure where Ashoka's reform campaign is headed next. But one thing is certain, he's just getting warmed up. The moral messages carved into rock were just the surface-level ripples. Beneath that, a deeper experiment is unfolding. How do you rule not with fear, but with Dharma? Ashoka's version of Dharma is tricky to define. It isn't strictly religious, but it's not just civic policy either. Think of it as a 3rd century BCE attempt at a secular ethics code, though with a lot more elephants. It emphasizes kindness, self-control, respect, and tolerance. It doesn't promote one god over another, and it doesn't replace local customs. Instead, it suggests that regardless of your beliefs, not being a selfish, warmongering jerk is probably a good idea. Still, historians continue to argue whether Dharma was genuinely spiritual or cleverly political. Some call it a moral compass, meant to uplift. Others say it was a form of soft power, replacing armies with ideas. And honestly, maybe it was both. Maybe Ashoka figured out that sometimes carving "Don't be cruel" into a boulder can be more effective than sending troops. As you reach the shade of a village banyan tree, you overhear 2 elders gossiping not about the weather, but about one of Ashoka's newest inventions, the Dharma Mahamata. Yes, we've met them before, but now you're seeing them in action. These are officials appointed not to collect taxes or enforce military service, but to promote moral welfare. Imagine government employees today whose job is just to check that your neighbors are treating their in-laws nicely. That's a real job under Ashoka. You watch as one such Mahamata speaks gently to a gathering of farmers. His tone is calm, soothing, a bit like your favorite librarian if she also had the power to report you for being mean to animals. He doesn't scold, he persuades. He reminds the people that harmony in the household leads to harmony in the state. A few of them nod. One looks like he's about to nap. You can relate, but here's the kicker. These officials aren't just domestic. Ashoka sends Mahamatas abroad to neighboring kingdoms, foreign courts, and tribal territories. There, tasked with sharing his Dharma message beyond the empire's borders, not through conquest, but diplomacy. No elephants charging into battle, just scrolls and soft voices. This is perhaps the most revolutionary part of Ashoka's rule. He doesn't just tell his people to be good. He assumes goodness is a universal currency, and in a world that usually defines power through conquest, he decides to experiment with outreach. It's less kneel before me, more would you like a pamphlet on compassion. Of course, not everyone buys into the idea. Some provincial governors grumble that moralizing doesn't plow fields or guard borders. Others find Ashoka's new tone suspiciously pacifist. There are murmurs in court. Is the emperor becoming too soft, too spiritual, too obsessed with animal welfare and not enough with revenue? One fringe anecdote, possibly apocryphal, definitely quirky, tells of a royal courtier who tried to sneak beef stew past the kitchen. Ashoka allegedly found out and made the poor man spend a week reading edicts out loud to cattle. True, probably not. But entertaining, absolutely. Meanwhile, Ashoka tries to strike a balance. While he discourages violence, he doesn't completely dismantle the state's ability to use it. Capital punishment, for example, doesn't vanish entirely under his rule, but it becomes rarer. Prisons still exist, but reforms focus on improving prisoner treatment. Pardons are issued more often, especially for first-time offenders. It's as if Ashoka is trying to parent an empire using gentle timeouts rather than royal beheadings. Pass through a small village near Taxila, where a debate is heating up around a communal fire. Two philosophers, one a Buddhist, the other a follower of Brahmanism, arguing about rituals. A Mahamata listens patiently, then reminds them of Ashoka's famous line, "All sects are to be honored." It's not a ceasefire, exactly, but it cools the tones. Tolerance is the new rule of law, but that tolerance has limits. Ashoka still believes in moral progress, and when someone refuses to play nisus, especially those preaching intolerance or cruelty, he makes it clear they're not welcome. Dharma isn't just peace and daisies. It comes with a spine dot. And so, you watch as Ashoka's message starts to reshape everyday life. Temple sacrifices become rare. Animal markets face new restrictions. Public festivals are encouraged to include moral teachings. Even royal processions look different, now less glitter, more gravitas. At one point, Ashoka reportedly cancels a lavish celebration to divert funds to a hospital for the sick. His advisors are horrified. His people quietly begin to admire him even more. You step into a roadside inn, Dharmashala, one of many rest houses Ashoka had built for weary travelers. The place smells of oil lamps and lentil stew. The beds are hard, but the walls are inscribed with more Dharma messages. Speak truthfully. Avoid envy. Practice purity in thought. It's like someone painted inspirational quotes, bore over the walls, but in stone and with fewer fonts. Still, there's something soothing about it. Ashoka's voice is everywhere now, not through force, but through repetition, like a lullaby hummed across centuries. You feel it in the roads he's ordered to be cleared, the wells dug, the trees planted at intervals so no one walks too long, in the sun without shade. The grand irony, of course, is that all this harmony comes from a man once defined by war. You sit back under another tree, the bark cracked with age, and ponder that transformation. Was it guilt that pushed him? Was it faith? Was it just a king aging into wisdom? Or maybe, just maybe it was strategy wrapped in sincerity. After all, an empire built on fear lasts only as long as the fear does. But an empire built on shared ideals, that's something different. You exhale slowly. Around you, the world of Ashoka feels quieter now. The chaos of conquest has been replaced with the steady hum of reflection, of change, of an emperor trying awkwardly but earnestly to be good. You close your eyes and drift a little. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rings, soft, echoing, a call not to arms, but to stillness. You rise early, long before the sun finishes stretching across the sky. and continue along a path lined with neem trees and distant temple bells. The world is waking slowly, and so is your curiosity, because today you're stepping into one of the most surprising moves Emperor Ashoka ever made. State-sponsored healthcare and welfare. Yes, long before modern democracies started arguing about hospitals and taxes, Ashoka was already busy digging wells, building clinics, and handing out medicinal herbs like some kind of ancient community pharmacist. You arrive at a small settlement near Pataliputra, his capital city, the brain of the Mauryan Empire. It hums with quiet order, and just beyond its outskirts sits a building with wide verandas and steady traffic. A hospital, not quite what you're imagining, no white coats or clipboards, but still astonishing in scope. Records and edicts suggest Ashoka set up facilities not only for people, but for animals too. That's right, veterinary care in the 3rd century BCE, somewhere out there. A very lucky goat is getting his hooves bandaged, thanks to imperial funding. Ashoka didn't just decree these services, he organized them. He had herbs imported and grown in government gardens. Roads were cleared and rest stops established. Trees were planted at intervals, not just for beauty, but for shade, which might not sound revolutionary until you've walked 100 miles in the midday heat. You pass one of these tree-lined rest areas, now a simple bench, a clay water jar, and a few faintly smiling travelers napping in the breeze. Luxury, Ashoka style. Historians still debate the full scope of this welfare network. Some argue it was symbolic, meant to show the emperor's benevolence, not necessarily to function. Others suggest that at its peak, it was genuinely comprehensive, reaching even remote corners of the empire. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. What's certain is this: Ashoka was thinking way beyond palaces and battlefields. He was in many ways attempting to construct a humane starter space where both humans and animals could live with a little more dignity. You pass through a marketplace in the late morning hay. There are fewer animals tied up for sale than you'd expect. The edicts had an effect here too. Ashoka, now a champion of non-violence, severely restricted animal slaughter, sacrificial rituals, discouraged hunting for sport, bad form. The local butcher, once the richest man in town, is now selling lentil cakes and muttering about changing times. But the people seem to approve. Ashoka's laws didn't just demand kindness, they made it convenient. Vegetarianism rises, and so does the trade in herbs, oils, and plant-based remedies. Here's a quirky tidbit you won't find in most textbooks. One edict goes so far as to list the specific animals Ashoka once protected, not just the noble elephant or the sacred cow. We're talking parrots, tortoises, squirrels, and yes, even ants. Imagine being an emperor with 1,000 things on your agenda and still making time to say, please stop stepping on the ants. You find yourself lingering near one of Ashoka's public rest houses, watching as two travelers, a merchant and a monk, share a clay jug of water. There's no guard standing nearby, no tax collector demanding coin. It's just there, available. You realize, slowly, that these institutions weren't only about service, they were about trust. Ashoka trusted that people, when given support, would take care of each other. Radical, right. But the system wasn't perfect. Corruption still crept in. Some Mahamatas overstepped their bounds, and local leaders sometimes ignored imperial decrees. Bureaucracy, like mold, has a way of blooming in damp corners. Still, the overarching tone remained, compassion as policy. You duck into the shade of a brick structured the remains of one of Ashoka's way stations. Inside, faint script marks the walls, barely legible now, but once loud with purpose. You run your fingers over a phrase translated as the welfare of the people is the duty of the ruler, for they are like children to him. A little paternalistic, sure, but the sentiment is rare for the time. Most rulers just collected tribute. Ashoka, by contrast, tried to give something back. There's an account, half history, half legend, that Ashoka once disguised himself as a commoner and traveled incognito to visit these facilities. Some say he wept at the sight of a wounded ox being cared for, murmuring thanks to the gods. Others claim he scolded his own officials for building too slowly. Historians, of course, still argue whether that ever happened, but it tells you something about the myth Ashoka built, one of an emperor who saw his people not as subjects, but as recipients of a moral mission. And here's where things take an even more unexpected turn. Ashoka didn't limit his welfare, projects to the heart of his empire. He extended them into neighboring lands, even those outside his formal control. In Sri Lanka, for example, his emissaries helped build Buddhist monasteries and medicinal gardens. In Afghanistan, inscriptions offer prayers for all beings. He was laying the groundwork for what some might now call foreign aid accept. It came carved in stone, not signed on dotted lines. You walk on, past another well-fed cow lounging lazily beside a stone pillar. You think again about the transformation. The same man who once orchestrated the mass killing at Kalinga is now the man who funds hospitals and protects squirrels. It's such a dramatic pivot that modern psychologists might call it post-traumatic altruism, or just good PR. But perhaps it was real. Perhaps Ashoka truly did change. The edicts aren't grandiloquent. They aren't boastful. They're oddly modest, almost pleading. Let my people be well, they seem to say. Let them live peacefully, and let the animals rest. By the time dusk begins to settle, painting the stones gold and the trees a deeper green, you find yourself pausing. Once more, a woman walks by, humming as she carries herbs in a cloth bag. A child drinks from a public spout. The empire breathes, not with grandeur or might, but with care. You sit, you listen to the birds. You imagine what kind of ruler chooses healing over hunting. You wonder what the world would look like if more did dot. And then you smile, because here, in this forgotten corner of time, someone already did. You wake to birdsong, distant and scattered, a gentle chime to greet another leg of your journey through Ashoka's strange, sandstone-smooth legacy. The air is cooler this morning, and your sandals tap against ancient stones as you walk not toward a battlefield or temple but a classroom, or something like it. Because today you're tracing the rise of Ashoka's educational and cultural outreach. And spoiler alert, he might have been the only emperor in history who treated his empire like a giant, open-air school. By now, the Dharma has taken root not just in edicts or in policy, but in how people think. Ashoka, it turns out, wasn't content to reform behavior. He wanted to reform minds, and to do that, he turned to education. No, not algebra and gym class. This was about values taught softly, through stories, through symbols, through something like propaganda, but with more animal parables and less national anthems. You pass a carved relief along the side of a village. Stupa. It shows a deer, a monkey, and an elephant, all cooperating to reach fruit on a tree. It looks adorable, but this is textbook Ashoka. These kinds of tales, early Buddhist Jataka stories, weren't just bedtime fables. They were moral scaffolding, helping people internalize Ashoka's ideals without ever reading an edict. Literacy wasn't required. You just needed eyes, ears, and a moment to pause. Ashoka funded monasteries that doubled as schools, offering not just religious instruction, but teachings in ethics, medicine, astronomy, and even logic. One of the most famous centers, Nalanda, would emerge later as a beacon of learning. But its spiritual ancestry begins right here, with Ashoka's investments. He helped elevate teachers to near-sant status. He sent gifts to monastics who mentored students. If you taught people how to live kindly, the emperor had your back. Historians still debate whether this was a calculated move or a genuine moral mission. Was Ashoka trying to future-proof his empire by creating a generation of ethically minded citizens? Or was he just trying to wash away the blood of Kalinga with kindness passed down like heirlooms? Whichever it was, the cultural result was undeniable. Literacy improved, religious tolerance bloomed, and an entire continent began to hum with shared ideas. You pause beside a traveling troupe of storytellers. Their voices rise like silk in the air, spinning tales of past lives and karmic justice. One story ends with a duck refusing to drink ply from a poisoned stream because it might harm the fish. The crowd claps gently. A child asks if that really happened. The storyteller winks and says, maybe. But isn't it better to be the kind of person who believes it could? It's no coincidence that Ashoka also ramped up the construction of stupas, domed Buddhist monuments scattered across the landscape. These weren't just religious structures. They were message boards, shrines, community hubs, and educational tools rolled into one. You spot one now on the horizon, a rounded hill etched with faint engravings and pigeons roosting near its peak. Inside, relics of the Buddha. Outside, a message from Ashoka: live well, live gently. And then there's the art. Under Ashoka, stone carving goes from military monument to peaceful mural. Instead of kings smiting enemies, You now see lions symbolizing vigilance, wheels representing the Dharma, and lotuses blooming, an ancient metaphor for spiritual purity. These aren't just decorative, they're teaching tools. Even if you couldn't read, you could learn. A fringe theory, whispered in academic circles with more hope than evidence, suggests Ashoka may have introduced early public lectures, open-air discussions, hosted by monks or It's not confirmed, but you imagine it anyway. A crowd gathering beneath a mango tree, listening as a monk explains why lying corrodes the soul, or how forgiveness can be stronger than revenge. Nearby, a child picks flowers. A dog naps in the shade. You smile, because even if it never quite happened that way, it could have. And in Ashoka's empire, that was enough. The line between myth and policy was as thin as rice paper. Ashoka even sent educational missions abroad when he dispatched emissaries to Sri Lanka, Egypt, and even parts of Greece. He didn't just send prayers and greetings. He sent teachers, scrolls, ethical concepts. It wasn't colonialism, it was more like ideological seeding, like tossing dandelion fluff into the wind and hoping kindness takes root on foreign soil. You stop at a stone marker near the coast. The inscription, worn by sea wind, offers a message not of domination, but of friendship. All men are my children, Ashoka once wrote, and as I desire for my children that they may be in great welfare and happiness, both in this world and the next, so do I desire the same for all men. Not exactly your average war cry. The modern scholar in you might squint and mutter about paternalism again, but there's no denying it. This emperor was dreaming far bigger than borders. He wasn't just changing laws. He was trying to change people, their daily habits, their thoughts, their instincts. Of course, not everyone wanted to be changed. Ashoka's reforms weren't universally loved. Some called it brainwashing. Others resented the moral policing. There were revolts in small corners. Monks who questioned the blending of state and spirit. Villagers who missed the old festivals with their drums and meat. Change, even kind-hearted change, always meets resistance. But here's what Ashoka understood. You don't need everyone to agree. You just need the idea to live long enough to keep spreading. And you, walking through fields, still bearing traces of those ideas, are proof that it did. The breeze carries the sound of temple bells again. A student recites a verse nearby. A teacher nods. A squirrel scampers over a broken stupa stone. And you realize something. Ashoka didn't try to conquer the world. He tried to teach it. You wake later than usual today. Maybe because the stone beneath your mat was unusually soft, or because the hum of Ashoka's empire seems to have lulled even your curiosity into a gentler rhythm. But as you rise and step barefoot into the warming morning light, you realize you're walking straight into something enormous, something heavy, not with war or politics, but with belief. Today is about Ashoka's transformation into not just a ruler, but a spiritual figurehead, a beacon of Buddhist kingship. Now, let's be clear. Ashoka didn't start his reign as a monk in Wei. We've already talked about Kalingatha, bloodbath that stained his early rule. But what happened afterward was nothing short of ideological metamorphosis. He didn't just adopt Buddhism. He lived it, breathed it, institutionalized it until it became fused with the very bones of his administration. You cross a courtyard filled with early morning chants, their tones rising like mist, and it's easy to believe you've wandered into the dream of a philosopher. You arrive at a monastery perched on a low hillside. Its weathered facade softened by time and the steady devotion of those who live here. This is one of many institutions Ashoka either founded or funded. Buddhist monks' Bekis moved freely in his empire, sometimes with imperial backing, sometimes under the quiet protection of Ashoka's name. These weren't just places of prayer, they were places of strategy. The king knew what he was doing. He began to frame himself in new ways. Gone were the traditional titles of conqueror or Chakravartin in the usual warlike sense. Instead, he began calling himself Devanempriya and Priyadarsi, the beloved of the gods, and he who looks with affection, not quite supreme emperor, but something almost fatherly, like if your granddad also controlled half of South Asia and handed out ethics pamphlets at dinner. Historians still argue whether Ashoka's spiritual transformation was genuine or politically savvy. Was he simply using Buddhism as a tool for unity in a multi-ethnic post-war empire? Or was it truly a path of penance, a personal reckoning on the scale of an empire? Maybe both. That's the thing about Ashoka. You can't pin him down to just one version of himself. He's like a river, always changing, always moving forward. You take a seat on a crumbling stone bench, beneath an enormous banyan tree whose roots have swallowed the surrounding bricks. A monk sits nearby, tracing lines in the dirt with a stick. He tells you about the Third Buddhist Council, held under Ashoka's sponsorship around 250 BCE. This was no small gathering. Think of it like the Davos of Dharma. Monks and scholars debated doctrine, expelled corrupt clergy, and attempted to purify the sanctum. Ashoka didn't just foot the bill, he got involved. Not in a heavy-handed way, but with that same quiet insistence he etched into stone. The truth should be clear, and people should live by it. A fringe theory even suggests that Ashoka briefly considered ordaining as a monk himself, that he flirted with the idea of giving up the throne entirely. The edicts don't confirm it, but they hint. Though I am a layman, one inscription begins. I honor the Sangha and strive for their advancement. It's like he wanted to step out of power, but couldn't quite bring himself to abandon the mission. There's something deeply human in that, isn't there? The push and pull between duty and desire, between worldly responsibility and spiritual longing. You wander into a prayer hall where dozens of seated monks chant in unison, their voices low and hypnotic. There's no throne here, no portrait of Ashoka, but somehow he's everywhere. In the rhythm of the chants, in the frescoes showing his donations, in the very peace of the place. He didn't build statues of himself. He built mood lighting for the soul. And he went beyond just funding temples. He carried Buddhist relics, actual pieces of the Buddha, or so tradition claims, and enshrined them across the empire. In stupas under trees, along trade routes, these relics weren't hidden. They were public reminders that sacredness was not confined to palaces. Holiness could be visited, touched, contemplated. You could stumble on it while chasing your goat. Here's a quirky tidbit. Ashoka reportedly opened up 7 of the original 8 relic stupas of the Buddha, divvied up the contents, and redistributed them into thousands of smaller monuments. That's one way to run a relic economy. Imagine trying that with modern museums. Hi, yes, we're going to open Tutankhamun's tomb, slice up the treasures, and mail them worldwide. Unthinkable now, but Ashoka did it with reverence and purpose. He wanted the spiritual heartbeat of the Buddha to echo everywhere. You head east now, toward the edges of his influence, where emissaries were dispatched to distant lands, Sri Lanka, even Macedonia. Yes, that Macedonia. Ashoka didn't just want Buddhism to thrive at home. He wanted it to travel, to cross rivers and borders and languages. His son Mahinda and daughter Sangamita were missionaries, carrying not just beliefs, but sacred Bodhi tree saplings, literal fragments of enlightenment packed for export. You find a quiet spot by a riverbank, the water whispering past like a scroll unrolling. Here, a small stone marker bears an inscription faded by centuries. But the message was once loud and clear. Ashoka sent messengers, not armies. Where once he marched with elephants, now he marched with metaphors. It's a very different kind of conquest, and yet not everyone bought it. There were skeptics, cynics, rebels. Some scoffed at his new pacifism, saw it as weakness. Others accused him of abandoning tradition, of bending too far toward the Buddhists and alienating Brahmins or Jains. Dissent swirled quietly, and Ashoka had to walk a careful path. He never outlawed other beliefs. Quite the opposite. His edicts repeatedly emphasized tolerance. Still, navigating belief systems in an empire that size, not easy, even with divine favor. But here's the thing that lingers as you stand and look across the empire's vastness. Ashoka didn't chase perfection. He chased direction. He knew peace couldn't be forced, but he also knew it needed structure. So he gave it temples. He gave it stories. He gave it symbols carved in stone. And somewhere along the way, he stopped being just an emperor. He became something else, something quieter, deeper. Not a god, not a saint. Just a man who tried to soften the world he once scarred. Few drift into a new landscape, now still within Ashoka's realm, but quieter, more subdued. The terrain flattens into stretches of farmland and village lanes, where the hustle of courtly proclamations fades into the hush of routine. Here, in the far-reaching limbs of the Mauryan Empire, you get a different sense of Ashoka's legacy, how his rule, shaped by kindness and carved in stone, was actually received by the everyday people who lived beneath his gaze. Because, let's be honest, grand ideals are one thing. But what do they look like when you're just trying to get through the harvest? The villagers don't quote edicts. They quote grandmothers. They remember stories, not policies. And yet, somehow, Ashoka's ideas made their way here. You see it in the way to herders pause to offer water to a stray dog. You hear it in the tale of the potter who refused to overcharge a widow, because, as he says with a shrug, even kings must answer to karma. It's not flashy, it's not royal, but it's Ashoka through and through. You wander past a market stall selling turmeric and tamarind, and the merchant, sun-creased and smiling, offers you a tale in exchange for a coin. It's about a farmer who found a golden goose only instead, pay of keeping it. He let it fly away because he feared the greed it would stir in his heart. The story ends with, and that's why we sleep peacefully. You nod. That one didn't come from the Rigveda. It came from the slow, silent work of Ashoka's moral messaging. Historians still argue whether the common people truly embraced Ashoka's reforms, or whether they simply nodded along and carried on. After all, it's hard to ponder universal compassion when your rice fields are underwater. But even skeptics admit that something changed during his reign. Executions declined, religious riots quieted, intercaste marriages while still rare met fewer obstacles. You can't force morality, but you can coax it, like warming a frozen stream until it begins to flow. There's a curious thing you begin to notice. The edicts themselves were not hidden away in temples or court halls. They were placed where commoners passed daily along roads, near watering holes, beside resting spots for travelers. We spot one now, almost swallowed by tall grass. The inscription reads, "Let no one cause another to suffer by deed or word." Not exactly imperial bluster. It's more like a father writing notes for his children, hoping they'll remember to be kind when he's not there. But not everything was smooth and sacred. Ashoka's moral crusade had its blind spots. For one, his policies, however well-intended, sometimes clashed with local customs. Animal sacrifice was deeply embedded in many rural traditions. When Ashoka denounced it and limited royal hunts, he upset powerful priestly castes. People began whispering, "Who does this emperor think he is, telling the gods what they should eat?" And then there were the Mahamatras, the Dharma officers. Ashoka appointed them to monitor moral behavior, spread his teachings, and ensure the people lived ethically. In theory, they were like ancient wellness coaches. In practice, they sometimes felt like the empire's conscience police. There are scattered reports, whispers, really overreach, of Mahamatras inserting themselves into family disputes, or punishing minor infractions like public scolding. A fringe theory even suggests that in some provinces they became more feared than the local governors. Still, the fact that these officers existed at all is fascinating. Ashoka wasn't content to rule over bodies. He wanted to guide hearts, even if it meant creeping into people's porridge bowls and marriage ceremonies. And yet, in many villages, the Mahamatras were beloved. They brought medicines. They resolved feuds. They read the edicts aloud for those who couldn't read. Theirs was a power wielded with soft hands. Most of the time, you stop at a wayside shrine built entirely of reclaimed brick. A fading mural shows a lion beneath a Bodhi tree, its eyes closed as if dreaming. A farmer rests nearby, sipping from a clay pot. When asked about Ashoka, he smiles and says, "He taught the strong to lower their voices." Then he offers you a mango, free, just like that. The reach of Ashoka's influence extended even to the sick and the poor. He ordered the planting of medicinal herbs along trade routes, the digging of wells, the building of rest houses for travelers and animals alike. One edict proudly notes, Pan, that even in the lands of the Greeks, the Cholas, the Pandyas, and the Tamils, medicinal plants were shared. Imagine that, an emperor bragging not about plunder, but about pharmacies. And yet, Ashoka was no fool. He knew morality alone couldn't hold an empire together. Taxes still had to be collected. Border skirmishes still had to be managed. Not all violence could be avoided, only minimized. Some edicts acknowledge this. The power of punishment is important, one says, but it should be used with restraint and wisdom. It's like hearing your dad admit he might have gone a little overboard with the no-desert policy. So what did the people really think? The truth is murky. Some likely loved him, seeing him as a rare kind of ruler who cared more about their children's future than his own grandeur. Others likely rolled their eyes, carving little prayers to older gods and grumbling about rice shortages. But what's clear is that Ashoka was felt not just as a name on a coin, but as a presence in daily life, in the rules of the road, in the design of the temples, in the bedtime stories passed down, even when his name wasn't. As the sun lowers and shadows stretch long across the rice paddies, you pause at a village where a festival is underway. There are lanterns made from banana leaves, drums echoing from bamboo huts, and children playing a game that involves pretending to be lions who eat their pride so they can be reborn as wiser deer. You watch, smiling. It's silly. It's lovely. It's textbook. Ashoka. And as you settle into the evening with the villagers, their laughter warm around you, you realize something humbling. Ashoka may have been a king, a reformer, a Buddhist icon, but here, in the folds of the empire, he tried to soften. He is something else entirely. He is the quiet voice that tells you, even in the smallest choices, to be a little better. The sun rises again, and with it you begin another slow walk through Ashoka's ancient empire. But this time, you're not headed for a palace or a monastery. You're heading toward a hilltop, not for the view, but for the stones, pillars, slabs, rocks deliberately chiseled and placed by imperial order. Today is all about the edicts themselves, the strange, stern, sometimes oddly poetic words left behind, carved into stone to outlast everything else, including himself. The first thing you notice is their placement. These aren't grand monuments nestled in temple courtyards. They're everywhere. Edicts on hilltops, along roadsides, near village squares, in places where you'd stop to rest your oxen or drink from a spring. That wasn't accidental. Ashoka wanted his messages to reach the tired, the traveling, the curious, the bored. He aimed for your eye line when you were most vulnerable to reflection. Like a well-timed fortune cookie, you run your fingers over one of these pillars. It's tall, several meters, high-carved from sandstone, and capped with a lotus and a roaring lion. The words spiral down the shaft, cut in early Brahmi script. The letters are rough but deliberate. They read like someone trying very, very hard to be understood. And that's part of their charm. These aren't polished royal decrees. They're more like public service announcements with spiritual undertones and just a sprinkle of dad energy. Respect your elders. Be kind to animals. Don't just tolerate other religions. Try to understand them. One edict even says, in so many words, try not to celebrate your own religion so loudly that it drowns out someone else's. In today's terms, Ashoka would have been the guy politely asking people to lower the volume on their Bluetooth speaker at a national park. Now, historians still argue whether these edicts were ever really read by the masses. Literacy wasn't widespread. Most people probably couldn't make out the Brahmi script, and Ashoka's own scribes had to be trained to write in it. But remember, these weren't necessarily meant to be read by everyone. They were meant to exist in public space, to be heard, repeated, and absorbed like background music that eventually seeps into your brain. That's why the edicts often start with phrases like, "This was said by Devant." They were recited out loud by officers, traveling readers, even monks on rest breaks. And the messages weren't just moral guidelines. Some were administrative. Ashoka talks about setting up welfare offices, appointing dharma, mahamantras, planting medicinal herbs, digging wells, and building rest stops for animals and humans alike. You imagine these edicts posted beside the ancient equivalent of a highway rest area. Now with fresh mangoes and free moral advice. But not all edicts are sunshine and mangoes. Some carry the weight of personal guilt. One edict admits flatly that Ashoka regrets the suffering caused by the Kalinga War. Even those who are not conquered suffer when others are. That single quotes us ... not your usual emperor talk. You almost expect the next line to say, "Anyway, here's a coupon for emotional closure." You move on to another slab, this one shorter, worn down by wind and goats. It's one of the minor rock edicts, often found on boulders near smaller towns. The tone here is even more personal. Ashoka speaks in the first person. "I have been a lay follower of the Buddha for over 2 years. One says, but it's only in the last year that I've made real progress." And suddenly, you're not reading a proclamation, you're reading a journal entry. A spiritual Yelp review. 4 stars for the Eightfold Path. But I'm still struggling with right speech. There's one more layer to all this. The languages. Ashoka's edicts weren't just in Brahmi. In the northwest, near what is now Afghanistan, they appear in Aramaic and Greek. Yes, Greek. Because Ashoka, for all his spiritual turn, knew how to talk across borders. Some of those Greek inscriptions say things like, "Let there be no slaughter or sacrifice of animals." Imagine being a Greek merchant in the 3rd century BCE. coming across this sandstone post and thinking, vegetarianism, that's new. There's even a fringe theory that Ashoka commissioned an edict in Tamil, though no such stone has ever been found. Still, the idea isn't wild. He was obsessed with reach. The edicts are like ancient tweets, carefully phrased, translated, and spread across what was arguably one of the first mass media campaigns in human history. No hashtags, sadly, but they got the job done. Some edicts are strange. One instructs people to plant banyan trees for shade and mango trees for food, as if nature itself could be planned into submission. Another prohibits the burning of forests, only in certain seasons. That's vintage Ashoka compassionate, but with a dash of practicality. You get the sense he wanted to fix everything with a well-timed regulation. A few edicts are almost hilariously specific. One lists the names of several neighboring kings Antiochus of the Seleucid Empire among them, and says, more or less, I sent them all some good vibes and a bunch of medical herbs. It's kind of like announcing, I just mailed some essential oils to my enemies. Let's see how they feel about me now. And yet, this mixture of high-minded philosophy and homey advice is what makes the edicts so compelling. They don't sound like commandments. They sound like aspirations. Like someone trying to build a better world and knowing full well how hard that is. Someone who made a mess and is now chiseling, I'm sorry, into every rock he can find. You rest beside a group of goats who've taken up residence near one of these pillars. They chew grass indifferently as you trace the ancient words. Somewhere, a Dharma officer may once have stood here reading aloud to travelers. Do not kill. Respect all life. Obey your parents. Be honest. It sounds almost too simple, but then maybe that's the point. Empires rise and fall, but decency, that's the real legacy, especially when it's carved deep enough to survive. Goats, tourists, and time by now. The Empire's rhythm is in your bones, the warm stone of the edicts, the whispering neem trees, the measured voice of a ruler long gone, but somehow still talking. Banned today, you find yourself on a path less paved, heading into the thick of philosophical India, the part that doesn't declare or instruct, but questions. Because while Ashoka carved many answers into stone, his reign also stirred up countless debates, not just about politics or war, but about the very soul of belief. You reach a small monastic grove. It's quiet. The air smells like sandalwood and wet bark. There's no temple here, just a clearing surrounded by ancient people, trees, and smooth boulders, where monks once debated under moonlight. And they debated plenty, because Ashoka wasn't ruling a spiritual echo chamber. His India was noisy, with ideas Vedic chants, Jain renunciations, Ajivika fatalism, materialist skepticism, and yes, Buddhist moderation. Picture a 3rd century BCE TED Talk, except with more incense and fewer slides. Ashoka had chosen Buddhism, yes, but not the kind with robes and rituals and lotus altars. He wasn't promoting Buddhism the way we imagine it today. He supported Dharma, kind of moral umbrella, not religious in the dogmatic sense, but ethical, practical, portable. He wanted everyone from Jain ascetics to Vedic housewives to Greek mercenaries to feel like his message belonged to them. And that created complication, because even among Buddhists, there wasn't a single version of truth. Historians still argue whether Ashoka's patronage steered Buddhism away from its original teachings. Some say he institutionalized the faith, turning a loose-knit path of renunciation into a state-sponsored lifestyle brand. Others argue he saved, it gave it scale, reach, and relevance. Either way, Buddhism changed during his reign. It grew teeth, and temples, and committee meetings. One quirky result of this spiritual expansion. The Third Buddhist Council. You wander into a half-crumbling hall where it might have taken place. Modest, dim-lit space with floor tiles worn down like river rocks. This council, convened under Ashoka's direction, wasn't just a friendly gathering of monks. It was a cleanup, a branding exercise. Ashoka had grown concerned about the rise of heretical views within the Sangha, the Buddhist monastic community. So he invited senior monks, scholars, and Dharma officers to hash it out. Think of it as the ancient version of unfriending people who keep misquoting the Buddha. The council's goal: clarify doctrine, standardize practices, identify and remove troublemakers. It was doctrinal spring cleaning with a hint of authoritarian incense. And here's where the open question arises. Did Ashoka's involvement elevate the faith or compromise its spirit? Some say he turned Buddhism into a civic religion, trimmed of its mystical edges and refitted for mass consumption. Others argue that his Dharma wasn't religious, at all more a moral philosophy meant to unite, not convert. You sit now beside a stupor, hounded, solemn, silent. The air is thick with the scent of mustard blooms. This one isn't grand like Sanchi or Amaravati. It's humble, probably built during Ashoka's lifetime. Inside, perhaps a relic bone fragment, a bead, a sliver of cloth said to belong to the Buddha himself. Ashoka loved relics. He collected them the way people collect seashells, then sent them all over the empire. One particularly dramatic story claims he opened 7 of the original 8 Buddhist stupas, redistributed the relics into 84,000 new ones, and launched a building spree like no other. Imagine the paperwork. Fringe scholars still debate whether Ashoka exaggerated those numbers. 84,000 stupas. That's one for every 10 people in the empire. But then again, this is the same guy who sent monks as far as Sri Lanka, Egypt, and Macedonia. Maybe he just thought big, really big. After all, if you're building compassion into stone, you need a lot of stone. One of your stops is a monastery still active, with monks in saffron robes chanting softly. The senior monk greets you with a nod and a bowl of lentils. You ask about Ashoka, and he tells you this. He gave us roads and roofs, but more importantly, he gave us permission. You raise an eyebrow. Permission for what? The monk smiles. To speak our hearts without fear. Then he shrugs and goes back to chanting. Monks are like that. They drop wisdom like it's lint and leave you to untangle it. Ashoka didn't just protect Buddhism, he exported it. After the Third Council, he dispatched emissaries in every direction, to Kashmir, to Gandhara, to Burma, to Lanka. His own son, Mahinda, and daughter, Sangamita, were among them. Sangamita carried with her a sapling of the Bodhi tree, the very one under which the Buddha had attained enlightenment. She planted it in Anuradhapura, in present-day Sri Lanka, where it still stands, older than most countries. You wonder what kind of suitcase she used, but again, the motives are debated. Was Ashoka spreading Buddhism to save souls or to stabilize his empire? Missionary movements can carry both motives: spiritual zeal and geopolitical soft power. Some scholars argue Ashoka saw the Dharma as a unifying code across a fractured empire. And what better way to unify people than by sending tree branches across oceans and building shrines with your name carved into the base? Yet he never forced anyone to convert. That's the twist. Despite the reach of his missions, Ashoka's edicts repeatedly stress tolerance. All religions seek control over the senses, one says. They should all be honored. Another gently chides his officials. Don't praise your own faith too much or criticize another's. It only causes conflict. That's not dogma. That's dinner table advice. You pass a mural in faded Ashoka, shown beneath a Bodhi tree, arms stretched out as if embracing the world. Below him are monks, merchants, kings, and peasants. They're all listening. Some nod, some smirk, some stare into the distance. It's a good depiction. His message was not universally accepted, but it was heard. And maybe that's the whole point. Ashoka didn't end suffering. He didn't purify doctrine or silence doubters, but he made room for reflection. He gave belief a bench to sit on, a tree to rest under, a road to travel safely, in a world bristling with borders and ambition. He carved out space for peace, not perfect, not permanent, but present. You close your eyes in the monastery courtyard. The chants continue. The breeze smells of turmeric and smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a lion pillar still stands, silent but watchful, like Ashoka himself, half emperor, half monk, full of contradictions. The wind carries your thoughts now, soft and swirling as you descend from the monastery into the dry, golden plains. You're no longer just tracing Ashoka's stone messages or the travel paths of his monks. Now, you're walking through his reform's actual lived changes in how people were ruled, fed, punished, and protected. Because while Ashoka spoke like a philosopher, he governed like an obsessive bureaucrat who read too many morality fables. And nowhere does that show more clearly than in his civil administration. Ashoka didn't just call for goodness, he hired it. He invented a whole new class of officials, the Dharma Mahatras. These were like spiritual social workers with clipboards and far-reaching authority. Their job: promote moral welfare, enforce compassion, file regular reports on how kind people were being to each other. Imagine being audited for your empathy. You spot one of their officers or what remains of it. A squat stone building near Bar Market Road, where farmers would come to report land disputes or sick oxen. The Mahamatras were here too, checking on prisoner welfare, handling complaints about religious discrimination, maybe handing out a few leaflets that said things like, "Please stop sacrificing goats near the communal well." It sounds absurd, government-funded kindness, but Ashoka took it seriously. The Mahamatras had jurisdiction across cities, towns, and even royal courts. Some were dispatched to foreign kingdoms. Others oversaw hospitals, tree-planting campaigns, and well-digging operations. If this sounds like the start of a utopia, slow down. Even Ashoka couldn't regulate the human condition out of existence. Still, these weren't empty gestures. One mainstream fact shines through. Ashoka built infrastructure on a massive scale: roads, wells, rest houses, medicinal herb gardens. Not just for humans. Either his edicts mention veterinary centers and shelters for sick animals. Yes, Ashoka was basically the original founder of PETA, centuries before hashtags, and he probably would have wept during Bambi. But not everyone loved these changes. Some saw the new Dharma state as intrusive. Farmers were told when and where to plant trees. Butchers had to limit their slaughter days. Temples lost some of their tax privileges. The merchant class, used to being left alone, suddenly found itself subject to moral inspections. It's one thing to offer free medical herbs. It's another to get a letter saying, "Your devotion to compassion has been found lacking. Please plant to banyan trees and reflect." That said, these policies did have a point. Ashoka's reforms weren't about flashy virtue signaling. They aimed to reduce harm. Take prisons, for example. He launched initiatives to improve prisoner treatment. According to one inscription, he made it mandatory for family members to be informed when someone was arrested, an ancient version of Miranda rights with a side of empathy. And if that wasn't enough, he offered prisoners a 3-day delay before executions to give time for appeals, rituals, or, let's be honest, bribes. This era also marked a rare historical emphasis on interfaith respect. Ashoka's empire wasn't homogeneous, it pulsed with Jains, Ajavikas, Vedic ritualists, and even early atheistic thinkers like the Lokayatas. And while other rulers might have enforced one dominant path, Ashoka made room. His edicts remind his officers again and again, do not cause friction between sects. You imagine his weekly meetings. All right, folks, let's do a kindness check-in. How many debates ended without a fistfight? Now, don't get dreamy-eyed. This wasn't a modern democracy. The empire still levied taxes, conscripted workers, and likely crushed dissent when it suited the court. Ashoka didn't dismantle the old machinery of empire. He simply redirected it. Where his predecessors burned forests to build palaces, he ordered trees planted along highways. Where earlier kings celebrated bloody victory, he celebrated moral awakening. One of his inscriptions, laughably understated, reads, "The sound of the drum has become the sound of the Dharma." But here's a quirky little detail. not everyone got the memo. Remote regions like Kalangatha, very land he once ravaged, were skeptical. Some villagers saw the Dharma officials as spies or meddlers. Others just ignored them. And in the distant northwestern territories, where Greek and Persian prefluences dominated, Ashoka's reforms barely registered. His grand moral machine had, like most bureaucracies, uneven mileage. Even among those close to the capital, the changes had side effects. Animal sacrifices were discouraged, but festivals relied on them. Religious leaders grumbled. Some priests lost their social standing. Others adapted, switching to fruit offerings and aggressive chanting. That's how culture works: bends, breaks, or quietly laughs behind the emperor's back. You reach a dusty courtyard in an old garrison town. There's a plaque, here modern, rusted, official. It commemorates one of Ashoka's rare military reforms. He didn't abolish the army, just tried to tame it. Troop conduct codes were issued. Civilians were given more rights during inspections. And while it's unclear how consistently this was enforced, it's telling that Ashoka tried. He may not have burned his swords, but he sharpened his laws. Historians still argue whether Ashoka's reforms were effective or performative. Some point to edicts, where he literally scolds his own officials for failing to act with compassion. Others note that while his policies were noble, their implementation likely varied wildly depending on local governors. It's easy to write "be good to your neighbor" on a rock. It's harder to make a tax collector care. You crouch beside a village well one of thousands built during Ashoka's reign. An old woman draws water with the ease of generations. She doesn't speak of Ashoka to her. This is just the way things have always been. And maybe that's the real legacy. Not a name in a textbook, but a cooler drink of water on a hot day. A tree's shade over a dusty road. A pause before cruelty, built into policy. And then you notice something else. A boy nearby has scraped his knee. His brother walks over, helps him up, and hands him a mango leaf to press against the cut. It's small, unremarkable, but it's the kind of moment Ashoka might have carved into stone if he'd been watching. Because empires forget, monuments crumble, but kindness, more practiced, lived as stubborn. You wake to the scent of dust and incense and the distant cooing of pigeons from temple eaves. Another morning in Ashoka's India though now. You're no longer just following reforms or edicts or royal proclamations. You're beginning to see what the Dharma meant to regular people, not the carved version in Prakrit on some distant pillet, but the whispered, worn-down version. The Dharma of potters and priests, of travelers and tailors. The kind of Dharma that survives not because it's enforced, because it's remembered. You stroll into a small town square, where two street performers are reenacting the Kalinga War in exaggerated pantomime. Children giggle as the emperor character collapses dramatically, clutching a fake scroll of remorse. Their parents half watch, half haggle with a fruit seller nearby. The performance ends not with glory or a triumphant cheer, but with a quiet prayer and a bow to a nearby tree, likely planted during Ashoka's reign. And that's the thing you realize, that Ashoka's Dharma was less about converting the empire into monks, and more about making decency theatrical, performative, yes, but also deeply human. One mainstream fact becomes clear. Ashoka's concept of kingship fundamentally shifted Indian political philosophy. Before him, kings were divine warriors, conquerors favored by the gods. After him, the ideal king became one who listened, who served, who gave rather than took. The Chakravartin model will, turning monarchs redefined to mean someone who ruled ethically, not just expansively. Even future Hindu and Jain rulers would tip their hats to this model, referencing Ashoka's name when justifying temple building or charitable project. He'd become a sort of ethical North Star even when his exact words were forgotten. You come across a weathered stone bench. On it sits a scribe, scribbling notes into palm leaf manuscripts. He doesn't glance up, copying old texts. He mutters, "For the monastery." You ask, "Which ones?" He shrugs. Ashoka's orders. Some old verses, couple of merchant records. Everything gets mixed together. That's your quirky tidbit. In some places, Ashoka's edicts were literally recopied onto other media, scratched onto wood, inked into cloth scrolls, or paraphrased in oral tales. It wasn't just about stone, it was about memory, legacy. Yet, even with that legacy, there's a gap of silence. For centuries after his death, Ashoka vanished, literally. No great shrines, no genealogies boasting of his lineage. Later dynasties barely mentioned him. It's one of those delightful oddities. One of the most powerful emperors in world history was forgotten almost entirely. Historians still argue why. Some say it's because his Buddhist identity made him politically inconvenient during Hindu revivals. Others argue his inscriptions, being in vernacular Prakrit and not elite Sanskrit, made them invisible to classical scholars. Others still think his Dharma reforms just didn't stick as deeply as he'd hoped. You walk through a temple courtyard where birds nest in the crooks of elephant-headed statues. The priest here admits he only heard of Ashoka through colonial archaeologists. He was in the stones, he says, tapping one with his toe, but not in our prayers. That's a powerful thought. You can inscribe a truth into rock, but if no one reads it, does it really echo? And yet, those stones remained unread, maybe, but untouched, like messages in a bottle waiting for the right tide. And that tide finally arrived in the 19th century in the form of a curious British scholar named James Prinsep. You've probably never written a fan letter to a numismatist before, but you might want to send Prinsep one. He was the man who cracked the Brahmi script, one used in Ashoka's edicts. Before that, the stones were just mysterious writings. After that, they spoke. Prinsep's translations triggered a historical renaissance. Suddenly, Ashoka wasn't just a ghost in the margin. He was front and center. Scholars began piecing together edict trails, matching pillars with place names, cross-referencing ancient Greek accounts. And what emerged was a portrait of a king who had tried something radical, to govern not by fear, but by principle. Even more astonishing, many of his messages matched what Buddhist chronicles had vaguely hinted at for centuries. And Deepavamsa's Sri Lankan texts had mentioned a great emperor named Ashoka, who built stupas and sent his children to spread the Dharma, but without the edicts. It all felt half myth. With them, it became anchored. Ashoka returned not just to books, but to public memory. You now wander into a modern Indian schoolyard. A mural of Ashoka stands behind the playground. Children in blue uniforms file past it every day, some offering a salute, others just ignoring it in favor of cricket. Their teacher, watching from a shaded bench, laughs. They call him the pillar guy, she says. Not wrong, really, he is. Pillar guy both literally and metaphorically. And it's funny, isn't it? The very rocks that once enforced his vision now simply decorate history. No one gets punished for ignoring an Ashokan edict today, but they still get quoted in Parliament, displayed in museums, turned into school lessons. You realize Ashoka's legacy isn't his empire. It's the aspiration to be better. That's what stuck. Still, there are questions that nibble at the edges. Historians still debate how sincere he was. Was Ashoka truly transformed after Kalingor? Was it a clever political pivot to consolidate a massive and diverse empire? Did his policies really reduce violence, or just relocate it out of sight? Were the Dharma officials wise counselors, moral spies? Maybe it's both. People are rarely just one thing. Ashoka was ruthless and remorseful, visionary and micromanaging, grand and deeply personal. He was a man who killed thousands and later banned animal slaughter on holidays. A man who preached tolerance but weeded out doctrinal dissent. A man who vanished for centuries, only to return louder than ever, his voice literally carved in stone. You end the day sitting on the edge of a ruined Buddhist monastery. The sun is soft. The wind smells of marigolds and stone. A young monk offers you rice and lentils, then returns to chanting. In the corner stands an Ashokan, pillar smooth, silent, a little chipped at the base. You reach out and touch it. It's cold, real, heavy with history. You think this is not just a monument. It's a bookmark in the story of human governance, ethics, and ego. And it's still turning pages. The pillar stands behind you like a lighthouse in time, casting its long, silent beam over the centuries. And now you start to wonder what happened next, not to Ashoka the man, but to the things he built. His ideas, his edicts, his strange combination of soft power and hard marble. Because if history teaches you anything, it's this: no matter how deep you carve your message, wind and rain and politics eventually find a way in. After Ashoka's death, around 232 BCE, things didn't exactly unravel overnight. The Mauryan Empire, once a sprawling network of roads, courts, and quiet elephants, began to shrink. His successors tried to maintain his balance of policy and principle, but they lacked the sheer force of vision he carried. Within 50 years, regions like the Deccan and Punjab began slipping out of Mauryan hands. Provinces declared independence, trade slowed, and local warlords crept back into the cracks of empire like vines in abandoned stonework. That's your mainstream fact. The Mauryan Empire collapsed roughly 50 years after Ashoka's death. Its last ruler, Brihadrata, was assassinated by his general. Pushyamitra Shangahu promptly took the throne and did not, shall we say, continue the Dharma policies. In fact, Pushyamitra's rule marks a sharp turn back to orthodox Brahmanism, and possibly even persecution of Buddhists. Imagine inheriting an empire of moral edicts and rest houses, and deciding, nah, let's go full scorched earth again. But here's your quirky twist. Despite the political collapse, Ashoka's physical pillars stayed standing. His empire might have vanished from maps, but the rocks didn't care. And while later kings came and went tribling, their own glory in copper plates and temple inscriptions, the silent voice of Ashoka kept humming under the noise. Most ignored it. A few built temples around the pillars. Some even tried, chiseling their own declarations on top, hoping to borrow his gravitas. Good luck with that, Dot. Now, picture yourself hundreds of years later in Gupta, India, around the 4th century CE. Buddhism is still around, flourishing even, but Ashoka is a distant memory. His name appears in a few scriptures, like a half-remembered dream, and yet the pillars remain mossy, chipped but stubborn. Some are mistaken for natural formations. Others are thought to be the work of mythical sages. The connection between man and message, lost, until someone gets curious again. A wandering monk, a poet, a British surveyor. It doesn't really matter who it only matters that the cycle restarts. History forgets, and then it remembers. You pause beneath the shadow of another pillar. This one's a bit shorter, partially buried, almost camouflaged by its age. A shepherd nearby ties his goats to its base. It's good luck, he mutters, not knowing why. And honestly, neither do you. Maybe that's the point. Ashoka didn't build a cult. He didn't try to be worshipped. His edicts don't say, praise me. They say, be kind, respect others, avoid cruelty, question yourself. How refreshingly unbraggy for a guy who ruled over millions. But that doesn't mean his legacy was pure. Historians still argue about how Buddhism itself changed under Ashoka's patronage. Did he uplift it or fossilize it? Before him, Buddhism was a small ascetic movement. After him, it was an imperial force, with monasteries, elite donors, and a growing list of rules. Some scholars suggest Ashoka's involvement turned Buddhism from a philosophy into a religion with rituals, symbols, and centralized authority. Was that progress or corruption? Even his missionary work gets scrutinized. Yes, he sent envoys across Asia. Yes, his children traveled to Sri Lanka. But did this expansion dilute the message? Adapt it beyond recognition? Was the Dharma really Buddhism, just a hybrid ethical code he stitched together from local traditions, Jain values, and a sprinkle of Greek stoicism. You walk through a grove of Niam trees planted along an old royal road. The path is almost gone, now just dirt and memory. But it's said Ashoka had shade trees and wells placed every few miles. Poor, weary travelers. That alone feels like legacy. To think of strangers, centuries away, and make the road a little softer for them. You stop at one of the wells. The rope is frayed, the bucket missing, but the stone lining still holds firm. You imagine a traveler, barefoot and sunburnt, stopping here 2,200 years ago. Maybe they cursed the emperor for raising taxes. Maybe they didn't care, but when they tasted the cool water, they thanked the person who made it possible, quietly, without fanfare. Just a nod to the air. Back in the cities, Ashoka's name flickers in and out of records. A monk writes about him in China. A king references him in Sri Lanka. A faded mural hints at a wheel-turning monarch. But its old scattershot Ashoka becomes a myth, a murmur, a half-smile at the edge of memory. And then, 1,000 years later, the Edicts begin to speak again. Thanks to Princeps translations, 19th century scholars connect dots across India. Suddenly, the same strange script appears in Allahabad, Delhi, Gurna, Kandahar. Like a cosmic crossword puzzle solving itself, the portrait of Ashoka emerges once more clearer, bolder, human. He's no longer just the pillar guy. He's the remorseful conqueror, the compassionate ruler, the architect of forgotten kindness. Today, his name adorns highways, hospitals, scholarships, even a major Indian airline. His lion capital is the official emblem of India, the four lions, but once crowned a pillar, now printed on every rupee coin. You probably held Ashoka in your hand without knowing it. That's how deep his ghost runs. But perhaps the most powerful tribute isn't national, it's personal. A man who made mistakes, donned them, and then spent his life trying to fix them. That's not a tale of empire. That's a tale of humanity. And as you lie down beside the quiet roots of one of his shade trees, listening to wind pass through branches planted for people he would never meet, you realize legacies fade, empires crumble, but intentions good. Ones have a way of lingering, even if all that's left is a soft patch of grass and a stranger's name, half forgotten, still etched in stone. The grass beneath your head is warm. You're still lying there beneath that tree Ashoka likely never saw, on a road he never walked, but one that carries his fingerprint in silence. You shift your gaze upward, watching the gentle sway of branches against the sky, and you think, after all these stories, all this stone and strategy, what do we really know about the man behind the edicts? You stretch your legs and rise slowly, brushing off the sleepiness. Ahead, there's one last region of the Ashokan puzzle that whispers in hushed tones. His family, not the marble-carved dynastic lineages or textbook regencies, but the actual people, the wives, the children, the quiet echoes of domestic life that almost never get etched into pillars. Yet if you listen closely, those silences are just as telling. Let's start with one name you hear over and over: Mahinda. This son of Ashoka becomes famous for something very unprincely, becoming a monk. Not just any monk, but a missionary monk who travels to Sri Lanka, helping establish Theravada Buddhism on the island. In fact, to this day, Sri Lankan Buddhist tradition holds Mahinda and his sister Sanghamitta daughter as the bringers of the faith, their national heroes. There's even a tree there, the Sri Maha Bodhi, believed to be a direct sapling of the tree Sanghamitta brought, planted like her father's ideas in the soil of strangers. That's your mainstream fact. Ashoka's children played a central role in spreading Buddhism beyond India. Their journeys weren't minor royal assignments. They became civilizational cornerstones in neighboring lands. And yet, there's very little in the edicts about them. No loving lines like "My dearest son Mahinda has gone forth, ... or to Sanghamitta, brave of heart." Nothing. The omission is loud. Historians still argue whether Ashoka was emotionally distant or simply culturally bound to keep family life separate from state proclamations. Or maybe, just maybe, those edicts weren't meant to be memoirs. Maybe they were blueprints, public-facing reminders of duty, not love. You pass by an old woman sweeping the steps of a temple. She points to a cracked statue and says, "That's Queen Asandatra." You blink. That name doesn't come up often. Supposedly one of Ashoka's principal wives, she appears in Buddhist chronicles as deeply pious, perhaps even helping with his early transformation. Another name, Tishyaraksha, floats up his later queen, who, according to some traditions, was jealous of Ashoka's devotion to the Bodhi tree and ordered it poisoned. A touch dramatic, perhaps, but deliciously human. Here's your quirky tidbit: Tishyaraksha, despite possibly attempting arboreal assassination, may have actually been the last consort Ashoka married in his later years when he was aging, slowing, and increasingly isolated. Some legends even portray her as a dancer from the court who rose to royal status. Whether real or embroidered by centuries of gossip, the image is stark. Ashoka, the empire's philosopher king, tangled in personal drama like anyone else. And if you're wondering about a will, a final message, some serene Buddha-like farewell carved for posterity, well, you'll be disappointed. Ashoka left no obvious death edict, no closing statement. He likely died in Pataliputra, the capital, around 232 BCE. But even that is foggy. No grand mausoleum, no fireworks. He simply vanished, like the soft end of a chanted mantra. That quiet exit feels oddly fitting. His life was thunder and reform. His death was mist. And yet some fragments hint at an ending worth noting. There's a document some believe, apocryphal, suggesting that in his final days, Ashoka tried to donate all his wealth to the Sangha, the Buddhist monastic community. When his ministers protested, he scaled down the gesture, giving away one last handful of jewels and declaring it enough. Whether true or not, the image sticks. a king trying to empty his vault before crossing into the unknown. Historians still debate whether Ashoka's late-life reforms were driven by genuine faith or imperial fatigue. Was it weariness that made him soften, or a revelation? Some even suggest that after decades of trying to build a moral world, he realized he could only build the scaffolding. The rest, the heart, the practice would have to be lived by others. You stroll now through the remains of an old vihara, a Buddhist monastery once patronized by Mauryan gold. Vines curl round crumbling walls. The scent of damp earth mixes with candle wax. Inside, a monk sits in silence, meditating beneath a mural that perhaps depicts Ashoka, or maybe it's just a generic king. Either way, the eyes are kind and tired. You kneel for a moment, not in devotion, but in reflection. What would Ashoka think if he saw today's world? Would he smile at the idea of hospitals and animal rights? Would he frown at social media outrage and newsfeed warfare? Or would he just raise an eyebrow and say, "Told you, it's hard work, this kindness thing"? You stand, and one last question drifts through your mind. Why do we remember him? Not just as a conqueror or a king, but as a cautionary tale turned hopeful parable. Is it the stones, the Buddhist texts, the way his ideas wandered into new lands and took root like quiet weeds? Or is it because we want to believe redemption is possible even for the powerful? And maybe that's the secret power of his edicts. Not that they're old or carved or royal, but that they reflect something we wish for ourselves. The ability to change, to heal, to try again. You step out into the fading light. A small bird flutters past. Somewhere, a child recites a lesson about Ashoka's pillars. The air is heavy with history and strangely gentle. It doesn't press down. It wraps around you like a shawl. The king is gone. The stones remain. But the message, simple, stubborn, soft, still walks beside you. You walk slower now. Each step less about distance and more about rhythm. It's nearing the end of your journey, not just across time or landscape, but across intention. The pillars, the edicts, the faded roads, they're behind you now, though somehow still humming in the soles of your feet. You pass a row of younger trees, their roots not yet deep, their leaves fluttering in tentative breezes. New growth, always testing the wind. Just like ideas, as you wander into the soft hills beyond Patalipitra, a thought settles in beside you. Ashoka didn't invent morality. He didn't create empathy or meditation or even religious tolerance. But he might have been one of the first rulers to try institutionalizing them. That's your mainstream fact. Ashoka built a governance model on ethical behavior, not just conquest. And whether it worked or not, whether it lasted or faded, is almost beside the point. Because it existed, because someone tried. Take a moment to picture his Dharma Mahamantras, again those special officers, tasked not with tax collection or military readiness, but with moral guidance. They traveled, they listened, they reported on community well-being and religious harmony. It's like if your DMV started handing out emotional check-ins instead of vehicle forms. Sounds absurd, but also strangely wholesome. Of course, there were limits. Historians still argue whether the Dharma policy was too vague, too idealistic, or even too intrusive. Some say the king tried to legislate kindness, a famously slippery endeavor. Others argue it was clever propaganda, a way to maintain unity in a diverse empire without outright favoritism, a diplomatic glue. And still others note what's missing from the edicts. There's not much about caste structure, very little about economic reform, almost nothing on the gritty mechanics of justice. Ashoka's focus was spiritual, moral, and possibly selective. A king's perspective is always a spotlight. You wonder, what shadows did it leave behind? You walk past a bend in the path where school children once played. You imagine them thousands of years ago, carving stick figures into the dust. Did they know they lived under a king with regrets? Would it have mattered? Maybe what mattered more was the rest stop nearby. The clear water, the shaded tree, pill sometimes. Mercy is just infrastructure. There's your quirky tidbit. Some surviving edicts mention surprisingly mundane things, like the need for mango groves, medicinal herbs, and proper rest shelters. Ashoka didn't always preach from a mountaintop. Sometimes he was just trying to get everyone a drink of water and a nap, in a way that's more touching than all the lofty words. You stop again. You're standing before one last pillar, shorter, fatter, more weathered. The inscription is almost gone, smoothed by centuries of rain and curious fingers. But if you run your hand over the grooves, you can still feel a trace, like a whisper from under the stone. Be less cruel, be more kind. Life is short. Don't waste it being awful. That's not quite what the Brahmi script says, but it's close. You sit nearby, let your thoughts wander, and here's a final scholarly debate to savor. Historians still dispute just how Buddhist Ashoka really was. Was he a devout follower of the Buddha, a secular reformer using Buddhist ethics as scaffolding, or a king trying to reinvent Dharma into something empire-friendly? The answers don't come easy. They shouldn't. History isn't math. It's closer to dream logic, full of symbols, broken records, and people doing their best, sometimes nobly, sometimes not. Ashoka was no different. He was compassionate, but calculating, spiritual, but strategic, a man of contradictions, written in stone. And as night deepens across the plains, as stars settle like dust in the folds of the sky, you realize something gentle and strange. You don't need all the answers. Not tonight. You just need the story, the walk, the hush of old words lingering on the wind. And just like that, your journey with Ashoka begins to fade into softness. Your feet are tired, but the ache is a kind wonder, kind that comes from walking far, not fast. The ground beneath you is cooler now, the grass a little damper, the sounds of the world narrowing to whisper. You lie back and look at the sky, wide and ancient and indifferent, just like it must have looked to Ashoka in his own quiet moments. Around you, the night moves slowly. Crickets hum. A breeze threads through tall reeds. Nothing needs to happen. No, nothing needs to be said. History can rest, just like you. The pillars stand where they've always stood. Most people pass them by without reading a word. Others stop, trace the letters, feel a tug of curiosity, and walk on. And maybe that's all Ashoka ever wanted. Not to be worshipped, not to be famous, just to be remembered. As someone who tried, who looked at a broken world with its battlefields and blind ambition, and decided to carve something softer into stone dots. So now, as you close your eyes, let that softness wrap around you. Let the distant drums of time grow quieter. Let the symbols, the scrolls, the debates all fade. Tonight, you walked beside a king who wanted peace more than power. That's rare. That's worth remembering. Now, sleep easy, traveler. The story will still be here tomorrow. End of script. Sweet dreams.